Hello and welcome to this video. This video is about the information GW has provided to the larger Warhammer community about the upcoming 8th edition 40k. Most of this information is available through the Warhammer community website and the new Warhammer40,000.com website, which is kind of an interesting new development. Both these are great sources of information, and they're really doing a good job in presenting the game in advance, something that, again, that's very new for GW. Really began with AoS in that regard as well. I like the idea of a dedicated website for the game, but there's also almost too many now to keep track of, which is something I never thought I'd actually say. But now there's like a half dozen websites or something that are on that now run by Games Workshop. Alright, so since information is flooding out, I'm sure that my commentary here will be outdated within hours. But I wanted to give my perspective on the changes as someone who's been playing AoS and trying to get back into 40k. The new edition of 40k coincides with the 30th anniversary of the game, so there are obviously a lot of changes in store. Specifically, a lot of changes that seem to be based upon the positive feedback concerning Age of Sigmar over the last year. And there are obviously a lot of elements of AoS that are being applied into 40k. However, if you're afraid that this is basically a complete AoS version of 40k, I don't think that's what is necessarily going on here. I think you could honestly say that they're taking the best elements, but they seem to have been incorporated in the new edition such that some of the original features of 40k are definitely still going to be there, and so that they should have enough unique elements between the games so that they're somewhat distinct and unique. So one of the things that has come out is the logo, or the new logo for 40k. And it features half a Loyalist Space Marine and half a Chaos Marine. You could definitely say that that has some similarities to AoS, where their icon is half associated kind of with Stormcast Eternals and then half Chaos as well in terms of like the icon. All the current codexes for 40k are being obsolete. I would assume that there will be a PDF for the armies just before or soon after launch, like with AoS, that does provide all the new rules. During periods of transition like this is something that GW has done in the past. Obviously, long before there was, long before people could really access a PDF, they used to just put out the complete rules for armies, between major changes in an edition. That's nothing really new. But I think what GW has done in some regard is they've basically learned from the lessons from AoS by clearly stating beforehand the implications, and they've also offered vouchers for people that have recently bought a new codex. This would seem to indicate that the new edition is coming out very soon. As someone who collects codexes for fluff and history rather than rules, I think this is personally a really good change for me, because my 40k codex collection is a little bit weak, and I'm sure the prices will go down. But I think that's, again, I think they've learned from their lessons in what they did with AoS, where it kind of, we all kind of knew that there would be this new change, but they certainly didn't announce it quite the same way. And, I don't think they're going to incorporate all the goofy rules and things like that they did initially in AoS to unit profiles. I think they've kind of wisened up to that regard. And, 40k is a little bit more, is a much more important a game to the financial success of the company. I think AoS has done extremely well over the past year, and as the years go by, I think it could become a much more viable enterprise than traditional fantasy really ever was. But 40K is still the driving engine of their business. So there are a number of changes and rules that have been announced thus far. After Adepticon, we received some of the first inclinations of these new rules. At the time, I really wanted to make a video just like this that compared some of the rules of AoS with the upcoming 40K edition. But honestly, when I looked at what had been announced, there were a couple of things. But by and large, it didn't seem that significant enough for me to really elaborate in general. What at the time they announced that there would be 3 ways to play, which is, definitely part of that. So you have open play where you can just play without rules. A version of the game that's more story based, where again you're not so much worried about army balance, but you're trying to forge a particular story. And then the third way with matched points. Again, they're going to have points right off the bat. That's, again, something that they learned not to do. But I think that this is a good way to do it. To be honest, 3 ways to play has always existed, right from the very beginning. It's in every single edition. You can find the statement in every single rule book about how you don't need to play at points. And then it goes on to basically describe all the rules. So the 3 ways have always been there. It's just nice to have them flushed out. Now, I will say, is open and narrative play the most dominant and popular ways to play for even Age of Sigmar? Not really. I think it's fairly clear that match play, certainly among the more outspoken members of the community, the people that do the podcasts and the people that are making YouTube content and such, most of these people are more focused on points, and you can elaborate that that's a reflection of the wider community. Certainly there probably are a lot of people still playing open, and they try to encourage it obviously on Warhammer TV. But I definitely think that by and large, match play is how 40K will be played. But having those first 2 ways clearly stated doesn't do them any harm, and it definitely widens the umbrella. Right? It makes it so that it's more easy and accessible, and if someone were to play narratively or open, you're not going to be like, what the hell is wrong with that guy? Right? It's a way that should always be viable. And it always has been, but it's nice that they kind of have it stated. And then in the movement phase, again, this is something that they basically said that the move values are going to come back. Each thing has its own strict movement profile. That's just like Age of Sigmar, but again, that's not too unusual, I think, even in 40K's history. In the combat phase, they're basically, these are things, again, that they announced at Adepticon. The charging units should fight first. And again, they say that it's a bit more thematic. But again, that's not part of Age of Sigmar at all. So, I think that and then in morale, they definitely went Age of Sigmar, basically the exact same route. So basically, every time you're in combat, you roll a d6, you add that number to the amount of models that have been slain, and compare that to your leadership, and if it exceeds that, then you lose more models. So you're going to lose the ability to just wipe out a unit if you win and they attempt to retreat or whatnot and they completely get overrun. That's going to be removed. I honestly like that in Age of Sigmar, though, because you can use a weaker unit that just has numbers to hold up a potential really more powerful unit for longer. You're not just going to get wiped and be overrun, and you don't have that horrible incident where like your best unit just absolutely like runs off the table. You will still lose a lot of casualties from this, but it won't be as much in one big blow. So those were the things that they announced initially, And again, there's a couple things that are Age of Sigmar related and others that are not. So I really didn't think there was much there for me to really talk about at the time. They've since come out with some more things, some more announcements about how things will work. I think it's very clear that the new edition will not have the same small core rule set like AoS. It will be smaller than it currently is. I've virtually no doubt about that. But it won't be, the few pages of rules. Now, they are going to adopt the hit profiles that are fixed. But there will still be, like in Age of Sigmar, positive and negative modifiers. I actually really love that about Age of Sigmar. However, strength is still one of the characteristics on the unit profile. And so that will still be a factor in determining wound rolls. That is not like Age of Sigmar. And likewise, initiative is still part of the stat line as well. Although I mentioned, if you charge in, you always get to strike first. I suspect there'll be rules like with the elves in 8th edition where certain things will always be able to strike first regardless. These types of rules can get overwritten. It wouldn't surprise me to see that. But I think both of these, both strength and initiative are not part of AoS, so that's definitely going to be a unique part of 40k. And you can deduct from that combat will not go back and forth as in AoS. So, most of my viewers probably do play AoS, but if you don't, it basically operates during the combat phase. Whoever is on that specific turn gets to nominate a unit to come to engage in close combat, and then you roll for their attacks, and then your opponent gets to select a completely different combat or unit, and that's not necessarily how it could go. It could still be like that, but they still use initiative. But I don't know. We'll have to kind of see on that. But I don't think it's going to be quite a mapping over of AoS in that regard. And I think, I don't know if the random turns will be in 40k either. I suspect they won't. Like in AoS, at the beginning of each round, you have to roll dice and you determine who goes first. So they are doing movement profiles that are fixed. It's not determined by infantry or vehicle. It'll be so certain armies are just going to move faster than others, which I think is an interesting dynamic. I'm glad they kind of returned to that. And again, they're introducing the option to retreat from combat. This is, of course, in AoS. It's actually a really interesting option that is not necessarily used as much in the strategic game as it could. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out in 40k. The example they gave is, I'm painting up an Imperial Guard army, so you could potentially have lines of infantry, and one gets engaged. You're not going to do well in combat, so you just move the unit out. You can't engage in close combat or you use their weapons or something like that. So it basically means the unit can't be used in the following turn, but it does allow them to now engage at range with the unit that you retreated from. So it can be actually pretty interesting. So both of those are identical to what is going on in AoS. I suspect they've removed templates from the game. If I'm missing something and they've already announced that, then I've just overlooked it. But I think, judging by the fact that the profile for a flamer basically hits a random number of opponents. So when you shoot, you roll the dice, it hits that many. So again, they removed the profile, or they removed templates when they created Age of Sigmar. In 8th edition, there were templates all over the place, but in Age of Sigmar they took that out, and that looks to be the same here as well. Armor piercing is still on weapons, but I would point out it works exactly like Rend in AoS. So, you're instead of having an AP2 weapon ignoring anything that has 2+ armor save, it basically just reduces the armor save by 2. So if you have an armor save of 2+ and you have an AP of 2, your armor save would go down by 2 points. So you still actually have a pretty decent armor, but not as great. And that's exactly the same as in AoS. And again, morale, as I mentioned, is the same. So basically, I think they kept some of the more important charts, basically strength versus toughness, and made many of the others obsolete. Experienced gamers know these charts very well. I haven't played 8th or 40k much in the last couple of years, but I could still name off all the profiles on those charts. Because, after playing for years and years, they're obviously not that difficult to memorize whatsoever. But I think they always were a barrier for new players. Even if the chart is fairly simple, just seeing a bunch of charts can be a little bit intimidating. So what they have gotten rid of is the chart for hitting your opponent at range, right? So the skill associated with that has been removed, and you're just going to hit on a flat number. That makes perfect sense because those charts are absolutely worthless. They have no viable use. They don't go up and down depending on modifiers or anything like that. It's just purely, if your ballistic skill is 4, you hit on a 3. So why have even a chart? Just put the 3+ on there, and that's exactly what they're doing. I think that there will be some changes in narrative. Obviously, that's constantly been ongoing with the Gathering Storm campaign. But honestly, this has been really started with the Blood Angels versus Tyranids campaign a few years back. And then that was followed by the Tau and Imperium campaign. And quite honestly, these campaigns really are what led up to the current Gathering Storm campaign. And what I find really interesting about that is that they almost coincide exactly with when End Times was really beginning on the fantasy side. So both of these huge changes in the games are really ongoing. And I suspect they almost basically use AoS to explore different ways to basically see if the game would work before they apply it to 40k. We've seen the new map for the Imperium, and there have obviously been a lot of changes there to reflect the Gathering Storm. Seems to be a much larger Eye of Terror kind of, lots of potential there for more chaos forces. There's a large empire down the northeast for the Necrons to kind of cause trouble. It's in general a much weaker Imperium. This has been a move that they've been trying to do for decades. I remember back in 2003 at a Games Day, and one of the big announcements then was that they're trying to make the Imperium look less invincible. It's always been weak to some extent, but I think they propped itself up so large that although they have all these other potential threats, there was always fairly good knowledge that the Imperium could not really lose on a massive scale, and clearly they have very recently. I think that the widespread, they're basically doubling down on the good guys versus chaos, which they did in Age of Sigmar, and the fact that the Eye of Terror or these other disturbances in the warp are really widespread means that chaos can kind of be everywhere, just as in the mortal realms. So there are some narrative things as well that I think are fairly close between AoS and 40k there as well. But we'll have to see kind of how it goes. I'm really interested in like those looking at the new 40k rulebook when it comes out and reading those actual statements. I like the idea of having a more widespread variety of areas within the Imperium that are potentially in trouble, or it's really interesting to see other empires within the Imperium. That's definitely something that's a bit new. So, will there be a new aesthetic associated with the AoS release? This is possible. Age of Sigmar has definitely had a huge change in aesthetic in the recent years with the new armies that have come out. And I think that that's a possibility as well. To be honest, part of this, in my opinion, has to do with the fact that new models are the bread and butter of the company. People don't buy older armies as much as newer armies. And they're almost at a point where they can't make better plastic units without changing aesthetic in a significant way. This has been a problem that's really come to the fore, I think, in the last decade, because they could honestly say that every new box of Space Marines would just be, in terms of the sculpt of the models, much better sculpts. And like in terms of how the models are made and manufactured, they're just quantitatively much, much better. Or, right, so like the Space Marines of the 90s, pretty static, and they got a little bit better, and they got a little better, and every single box set gets a little bit better. But I think they've reached a point where they can't come out with a new Space Marine box set that is that much better than the previous box without making significant changes to how they look. So I think, honestly, there are always pros and cons. I think, in general, they're keeping the best elements from AoS, but trying to make the game as unique as possible. And most of the people that actually play AoS would say that these are the qualities that, for them, are hands down really good qualities in the game. These are not things that are controversial within the AoS community at all. And they seem to have basically left out some of the more controversial elements, like going back and forth in who gets to go first each turn. Some of people aren't going to like the changes in the rules, because you can always come up with some sort of narrative for or against any rule. I mean, it's a game. It's not real life. You can always think up a situation that doesn't work. If you don't like, in the close combat phase, whoever charged in gets to go first, I totally get that. You can always envision the enemy being really, really fast, and such that whoever charges in, the people that are getting charged can still attack back. And as I said, I think you'll still see that. There might be a rule where they always get to strike first. But my point is, you can always create you can always envision a way in which a rule could be right or wrong in terms of how it plays out in the narrative of the game. But I think that's the important point, is that we do focus on the narrative. In most cases, it's better if the charging unit does get to strike first. The bottom line for me with regard to these types of complications is that the game is a loose representation of a type of warfare that none of us have a lot of experience with. As someone who has been in the Army Reserve, I've used a gun a few times. And the closest thing I've encountered that would resemble close combat would be back in like school, like when I was really young. So it's not something that have a lot of experience with. And frankly, the type of thing that they're envisioning in 40K is beyond really anyone's experience. I think that they've simplified the game such that it will be better for new players. There's been a lot of new players coming into AoS that have never played a tabletop strategy game before. A lot of people coming over from 40K because they like the simplicity of it. I was never too troubled by the complexity of 40K. And again, I do hope that it still is there to some extent. But you can still have a very strategic game with something that's a little bit more basic. In my own experience in 40K, I remember, I played regularly 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition, a little bit in the current edition of 40K, just a few games. But even I am overwhelmed by the amount of variety of rules spread across really too many books, and the language that's used by the gaming community is not always expressed even in the books. So knowing what players are referring to when they use an abbreviation or something like that, or an acronym that I'm like trying to figure out what the hell they're even talking about. And I've played 40K. So someone coming in new, that's a huge barrier. So I hope that this is in some way less of a barrier for new players. I think in many respects, the game, because it has some fixed stats, will be a little bit more brutal. In terms of how it does look like the hit and wound thing might be somewhat similar to the current edition. Again, ranged attack, that's going to be the same. Although hit and combat is, I believe, now completely fixed. So you're going to get more models completely dying, right? Marine on marine combat won't be as complete a stalemate quite as it was. And I think that that's a positive change, definitely. I mean, one of the best things about Age of Sigmar is, even if you lose the game, you often kill enough models that it doesn't feel like you just got stomped. Even though, from a strategic standpoint, you may have just got stomped. But you've killed significant portions of your opponent's army. And so you feel like it's gone okay. It's not, well, I lost the game strategically, but, I still had a good time. I think there's a lot of games of 40K where you lose the game strategically and maybe you just didn't do anything to your opponent at all. And that's kind of a little bit underwhelming. So I think, to close off my rather long ramble, I'm actually looking forward to the new edition. I think it has enough unique properties. I certainly don't want it to be the exact same rules set of AoS, but in a different context in terms of the narrative. That would be a bad mistake for them to do. But if they can look at what has worked very well in AoS and apply that into 40K, I think it would be a very strong addition. And I think it will, again, encourage crossover between gamers to play both, which, some people will criticize that business strategy. I think it's perfectly legitimate, in my opinion. But I'm looking forward to the new edition, and we'll see what more information comes out. Thanks for tuning in. Sorry it became such a ramble. All right, have a good one. Bye.